tuned for another original Studio B production right here on the Voice 17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. There was the voice of which that spoke intelligent words on how we should react to life itself. There was the door to which we had no key, a veil beyond which we could not see. Some talk a while of me and thee there was, and then no more of me and thee. That's from Omar Khayyam. We're today going to lift up some gallant warriors, the Tuskegee Airmen. The Airmen, which was a product of Tuskegee Institute and a part of the brain thrust, the brainchild of Booker T. Washington. Now, we've had a lot of differences in our race about some of our leadership. We've had people who are on the left and who are strong civil rights advocates to downplay the accomplishments of Booker T. Washington. But I'm going to stand before you and tell you my feeling is that Booker T. Washington is one of the greatest and most successful of our historical Black leaders. He had his own opinion and approach to things. Cast down your buckets where you may. In other words, use what you have to get where you want and do what you need to do. Cast down your buckets where you may. Booker T. Washington brought in great men to his organization at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Great men, and did some great things. One of those men was a man by the name of George Washington Carver, who almost single-handedly with his ideas saved the country, saved the South's agricultural economy. But not only that, with the construction of the Tuskegee Airmen program, then his strength, his wisdom, and his skills with these wonderful young Blacks to help the United States defeat the fascist state of Germany and Italy and Japan. I find it very interesting that Japan during the Second World War and Germany on the same side. When Hitler was talking about the superiority of the white race, and Japanese sure ain't white. Nothing white about the Japanese. But what we realize is that good ideas and evil ideas can come from people no matter what their race is. The imperialistic country of Japan, which swept through the Pacific, conquering China, Korea, conquering the Philippines, bombing and killing 3,000 individuals at Pearl Harbor, had some very fascist, racist ideas. Sad thing about the United States of America and our leadership is that we step in our foot in that racism. And instead of dealing with just the nation of Japan, we had many Japanese citizens in this country, and our government took it out on them, put them in concentration camps, treating them as if they're less than human. That happened. And we had leadership like Booker T. for Washington, wanted to make sure that our people, even in war, had their place. They were not supported by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I don't care who don't like it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not integrate the armed forces, did not integrate public housing, did not end discrimination against minorities and people of color, or women for that matter, in employment, housing, and in any kind of way. Yeah, we call him a great guy. He aligned himself with the Dixiecrats of the South, who were staunch racists, which helped to maintain his power. Not to say that he didn't do some great things, but if it weren't for Eleanor Roosevelt and the bugs she put in her husband's ear constantly, the Tuskegee Airmen would not have the resources to do the things that they did. Last week, we showed you the part one of a video that we captured on YouTube, which lifted up and all of the many accomplishments of the Tuskegee Airmen, and also pointed out the brutal, racist, segregationist treatment of these men. Even in the South, you know, where their school and their training was located, they were treated like they were less than human beings. It was a horrible thing that was done. And in the meantime, some of our so-called Black leadership, instead of supporting each other, I'm talking about some people who I really like, and begin to find out things about people like Du Bois that should have supported Booker T, did not. And Du Bois did a number of things like that. Worried about his so-called talented men. Very much hung up on class and education and determining who's worth in this society. One thing I say about Booker T, cast down your buckets where you may. He lent a hand to every level of society when it came to African Americans. Poor folks, poor Black farmers had a chance under Booker T's program. Young college students with 1 or 2 years of college, young African Americans who wanted to learn how to fly, did learn how to, had a chance under Booker T's program. Yeah, I'm listening to Booker T, but I'm tired of hearing the garbage that I hear sometimes about this man simply because he don't think like you do. Woodrow Wilson, a racist demagogue of a president if there ever was one, invited Booker T to the White House. He also invited George Washington to the White House because they were the most noted of the Black leaders of that time, that day. But at the same time, he invited members of the Klan, Ku Klux Klan, who they had a movie that they produced denigrating Blacks. But at any rate, Booker T stood strong, was able to get the resources that he needed to build up the Tuskegee Institute. The Tuskegee Institute stands today as a very fine example of what can be done. And the other thing is, with all of the adversity that was thrown at our people and thrown at our young men, they still got it done. Some people were washed out of the program, but others were able to withstand the racism. In fact, they even brought racists into Tuskegee to oversee the program because, you know, they couldn't let a Black person first oversee the program. They had some racist individuals to do it. Then Benjamin Davis Jr. eventually was given some responsibility and took over the program and began to make it work. So we looked at a lot of things. I wanted to lift up the Tuskegee Airmen. I had the pleasure, by the way, been in broadcasting for many years, lived in the city of Seattle for 11 years and had a constant broadcast. We did a documentary on the Tuskegee Airmen and interviewed many individuals in that chapter years ago. They have chapters in different parts of the country where the airmen exist, and they still do. So, a little more to say. Let's lift up this video and take a strong, good, positive look at the red tails for the Tuskegee Airmen. Let's do it.
36 missions.
Up until then, it was just reading letters. But to see the men actually in action was just almost more than I could take.
The 99th United States Fighter Squadron is composed entirely of Negro pilots.
Bowing to determine steady pressure from civil rights leaders, the Army activated 3 more fighter squadrons. And in a major breakthrough, an all-black bomber group.
Initially, the Air Force had shied away from having African-American airmen fly bombers because it would mean a much greater investment. As opposed to having one fighter pilot, you would need a bomber crew. That might be 8, 10 men. You need ground crews to work on twin-engine planes.
After training at Tuskegee, the new bomber and fighter squadrons transferred to Selfridge Field, Michigan, just outside Detroit. These airmen faced a home front battle they hadn't trained for. By then, several war-hardened veterans such as Charles Dryden had returned to serve as combat instructors.
There was as much segregation in Selfridge as there was in Tuskegee. Different was, in Tuskegee, you knew what to expect. You didn't expect that in places like Detroit, California, New York, and Chicago, but it was there.
At that particular base, you had a magnificent officers' club, great theater, great sports area. Well, when we got to Selfridge, we were told that we were not to use those facilities, and that we were, no matter whether we were pilots in the Air Corps, we were still second-class citizens.
Lord have mercy. But these pilots knew that discrimination violated official Army regulations that said all officers could use base clubs. The regulation made no mention of race. Backed by the letter of the law, the airmen made a bold, calculated move.
So we went to the club, tried to integrate the officers' club, which was lily white, fully segregated. And I said that there's an Army regulation that says officers assigned to a base are obligated to support that club with their presence, their dues, and their participation. That's the club, we're officers, that's the regulation, here I am.
They were really very angry, and you do see this with the men, men like Charles Dryden, who came back because they felt, I've flown 50 missions over Germany, I've fought the enemy, and I'm not going to take this kind of treatment.
The Air Force's response? Transfer the squadrons to bases across the South. Once there, the men found a situation they never could have imagined. Enemy prisoners of war had been captured in huge numbers, some 300,000 in the North African campaign alone. Many of them were transported to military stockades in the United States. The Black Airmen ended up at some of these same bases.
Actually, the prisoners of war were used to work around the bases, and they were also allowed to go to town, which was unheard of. And they could move freely around the post. They did wear a P on their back, prisoner, but they could go anywhere they want.
We saw German prisoners of war who could do things that we couldn't do. They could sit anywhere in the base theater. We had to sit in the segregated color section. They could go in the PX cafeteria to have a meal. We couldn't even go in the building. I became furious. I just couldn't understand.
The invasion of Sicily by Allied forces under the supreme command of General Eisenhower was preceded by very heavy aerial bombardment.
A month after the Allied invasion of Sicily, Spike Momeyer, still indignant about black men serving in the Air Forces, sent a memo up the chain of command that threatened the existence of the Black Fighter Squadron.
He never wanted to have African Americans under his command. He didn't think they could succeed, and this was the easiest way to get rid of them.
Colonel Momeyer writes this memorandum calling them cowards, calling them incapable of leadership, saying that they are not up to the performance that his men were demonstrating, the other squadrons, his white officers, and saying basically that he thought the experiment was failing. This is a damning report.
As the report rose through the officer corps, ranking generals stamped their approval and added comments of their own. The Negro type has not the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot. They lack aggressiveness and the will to win. Time magazine got wind of the report and publicized the criticism in an article titled, "Experiment Proved?"
And so Davis suddenly finds himself called to Washington to defend the performance of the 99th Squadron against Momeyer's accusations.
In a masterful press conference, Davis challenged the allegations head-on.
The pilots of my squadron were eager to meet the German and really fight it out. One of my pilots was shot down by flak in the Mediterranean and forced to sit in...
He does point out that his men are actually flying more missions than their white counterparts because there are fewer of them, that they have performed the missions adequately. They have shot down German fighters, even in these inadequate P-40s.
We provided air support for ground troops by dive bombing. We strafed strong points, holding up their advance.
And then he says, my P-40 squadron is performing equal to or better than any other P-40 squadron in the Mediterranean. And that becomes the key.
The War Department took the bait and called for an investigation into the combat performance of the Black Squadron. Hard statistics, not prejudice, would determine the fate of the unit. Far from the mounting drama in Washington, the 99th was focused on fighting Nazis. The Germans had retreated to the mountains of central Italy, gaining a significant defensive advantage. The Allies came up with a new plan. Reinvade just below Rome at the coastal city of Anzio and cut across the peninsula, strangling enemy troops to the south.
The 99th, luckily, was given the mission of protecting this invasion fleet there at Anzio. And the 99th came eyeball to eyeball in air-to-air combat with the German Luftwaffe.
99th pushed themselves and their outdated P-40s to the limit. After 2 days of ferocious dogfights, newspapers back home cheered their astounding victories.
It proved that if you take any group and you give them training and an opportunity to exercise that training, they will do extraordinary things.
The Anzio invasion began to restore the 99th's reputation. Time magazine changed its tune and trumpeted the squadron's success, saying, "Its victories stamped the final seal of combat excellence on one of the most controversial outfits in the Army." Final vindication came from the War Department itself. At the end of March, the Pentagon released its report on the performance of the all-black squadron. It concluded there was no significant difference in combat efficiency between the 99th and other all-white aerial units.
By the grace of God, this congressional committee that had been appointed said, leave the 99th be.
We were overjoyed when they said that they would remain in combat, even though there were those of us who wanted them to come home.
The 99th had won the chance to prove its worth. By spring of 1944, the 3 additional black fighter squadrons had arrived in Italy. They joined forces with the 99th to become the 332nd Fighter Group and relocated to Ramitelli on the Adriatic coast of Italy. Ramitelli, like Tuskegee, became a world of its own.
At Ramitelli, we lived in tents, one after another, in what we called tent row. We had a mess hall, and we had a place where we just hang out. It was a community.
We were segregated. We had segregated bases. We didn't visit the white officers' bases, and so I never saw too many, had in contact with many white officers or anything.
Now, in terms of the Italian population, we were on an old farm, and there were people around who were farmers. And there were some children around, and we would usually adopt 1 or 2 kids to come in and bring us some eggs and to do our laundry. And I have to say that there was no prejudice in that sense. The only prejudice might have occurred where white soldiers said that blacks had tails or something like that. But the Italian people were Americans.
By early summer, the Allies had liberated Rome. In the north, they landed on the beaches of Normandy in the D-Day invasion. The tides of war had turned. Allied long-range bombers were flying into enemy territory in full force.
Bombers are trying to just bomb the Germans into submission to make it impossible to continue to wage the war by destroying their industrial might.
B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers lumbered through the skies, raining destruction on strategic sites below. But their size and slow speed made them easy targets for enemy guns.
And every time an enemy fighter shoots down a bomber, it shoots down 10, 11, 12 men.
In February 1944 alone, The Allies had lost 114 bombers and more than 1,000 crewmen. Allied fighters were supposed to accompany the giant warplanes to protect them from German attack. But some fighter pilots were more interested in racking up kills than babysitting bombers.
Now, a lot of guys, they would jump Germans and chase them and shot them down. Well, if you move in between 330 and 430 miles an hour, 5 minutes of flying puts you, what, 20 to 30 miles away, right? You're away from the bombers. You're not providing the protection.
General Ira Aker, Allied Air Force commander in the Mediterranean, had a plan. He asked Benjamin Davis if his men were ready to escort long-range bombers into the German heartland, an assignment vitally important to the war. Davis jumped at the chance.
Increasingly heavy blows in the Allied cause are now being struck by the various American air forces in all theaters of war.
As the pilots took off from Ramitelli, they knew the stakes were high.
Once we were there, we knew what we had to do, given the circumstances in which we came into the war. If we had lost bombers, we would probably be pulled out of the sky.
Davis instructed his men in no uncertain terms.
His rule was that he didn't care if anyone ever became an ace, but that if you left the bombers so that they could be hacked up by enemy fighters, that you would answer to him.
Basically, the bombers would be here, we'd be above the bombers, and we would be weaving in groups of 4 planes across the bombers to provide sort of a net against the German planes coming down.
I guess I was like all the rest of these characters. I wanted to be an ace. I wanted to shoot down some Germans so when I got home, I could tell my girlfriend that, yeah, I was an ace. We'd sit there over those bombers at 25 or 30,000 feet, and somebody would say, bogeys at 9 o'clock. You look out at 9 o'clock, 15, 20, 30 miles away, you see little black specks. You knew they're German fighters. Normally, some fighter groups would say, tally ho, but not with Colonel Davis.
Along with the new high-profile assignment came a spectacular new airplane. The most advanced tactical fighter in the war, the P-51 Mustang.
Well, I think it felt like going from a Model A Ford to a jet. It was a real transition, a real refinement.
My check out in the P-51, that was half scary and half joyous. Once I got the bird in the air, hey, I was in hog heaven, you know, because it was a nice flying bird.
Flight speeds of 440 miles an hour, excellent high altitude performance. It's the ideal plane. Even a hand-me-down P-51 is a better plane than anything you have ever had. You've got the plane to match up now and go the distance.
All fighter groups had distinct markings on their planes. Candy stripes for one unit, a checkerboard tail for another. The Black Airmen would be no different.
We started our escort missions, and I'd say after about 50 or so, we said, well, we'd better get a real name and identification so that we would be sure the bombers and the Germans would know when we were on a mission. And it was decided jointly that we would paint the tails of all those 51, 72 of them, red. And we changed our call sign to Red Tail, and we became known as the Red Tails.
Through the fall of 1944, the Red Tails escorted bombers day in and day out as they hammered away at the enemy. The bomber groups were stationed at their own bases across Italy and would take off in advance of their fighter escorts.
We usually took off exactly at 7 o'clock in the morning. And the colonel would pull out on the runway, and we'd pull out behind the plane that we were to fly next to. And about 30 seconds before 7, you could see his engines revving up and down the runway he'd go. And then we had to follow in 30-second intervals.
We could hear the bombers going over. They'd be going over while we were still down there on the ground getting together. We could see the formations.
We would take off, one group going one way, one group going the other way, at different times, of course, making a big circle, and eventually find 16 planes here, 16 planes here, 16 planes here, headed out to meet the bombers. A beautiful, beautiful thing, really a logistical miracle in a sense, that we could make this big circle and come around with all of our groups ready to go out in combat.
As soon as we crossed the Alps, the anti-aircraft stuff was popping in the air. I said, what am I doing here? I want to go home.
As the bombers pushed deeper into enemy territory, the escort missions became increasingly dangerous.
We were nervous, and any fighter jock that said he wasn't nervous is lying to you. I thought I was bulletproof, changed in a hurry. Fear beats the hell out of you from time to time.
I remember many a mission that I've been on it. All of those targets were heavily guarded. They had all kinds of flak guns down there. And we could see all this flak coming up, you know.
They'd fire from the ground, and when the shell explodes, it throws all these pieces out. That's what tore airplanes apart. The B-17 formation was never turned back in the history of World War II once they're on a bomb run. No matter how many fighters, no matter how much flak, we were trained and trained well for one reason, and that was to fly that airplane straight and level on a bomb run and drop our bombs.
And there were quite a few missions that we escorted crippled planes back. We'd stay with them until they got out of enemy territory or enemy aircraft had attacked them. So if they would, at least they wouldn't get shot down, we'd stay with them as long as we could.
One time I came home with 2 engines gone and 2 of them leaking oil, and it was a dangerous business. There's no question about it.
Always short of pilots. A tour of duty for a white fighter pilot was 50 missions. A tour of duty for the black pilot wound up being as many as 70 missions, 40% more than our white counterparts had to fly. And the black pilots were flying 4, 5, 6 days straight before we could get a day off.
So Davis, one of the other ones, say, you know, if you leave, we're in trouble. We're short. Will you stay? And we'd always say yes. And so the missions went on and on and on.
All of these guys were playing Russian roulette. The life expectancy of a fighter pilot was probably 15 to 20 missions.
Keep in mind that we're talking about guys who were 19 like myself, The old dudes were 23, you know. They had just passed teenage and just gotten there. And to accept and live with these losses was something they had to go into.
I used to call it the lonely night. You come back home, you're flown with a guy all day, and I saw 2 of them get killed. There's an empty bed over there, and you don't rest well that night. But then you get up the next day, and they say, okay, you're on a mission, you do it.
I don't really recall us having any special ceremonies or anything, but you had to keep going. You'd come in the next morning at 5 o'clock maybe, they'd call your name saying you're on that mission, so you get up and you go out and you fly, and you don't have time to think about it too much.
But those back home could think of little else as they awaited word from their loved ones.
As I tell young people, no cell phones, no computers. In some areas, no phones for guys who came out of rural areas, not even a telephone, you know. So you waited for the snail mail. And that was slow as all get out because it was wartime, you know, so you just waited.
And when I'd get a letter from him, many times I'd be at work and my mother would be at home. I lived at home while he was gone. And my mother would call and say, "You've got a letter." We were all excited, couldn't wait to open it. And I couldn't wait till I got home, and I'd say, "Read it to me, Mama." So she would open the letter, and I could feel her blushing over the phone. Some of it was quite graphic, I think. And he was so upset when he found out I was letting her read his letters to me. But I couldn't wait till I got home to read them.
The Red Tails began to develop a first-rate reputation among the bomber groups. Some fighter pilots named their planes after wives and girlfriends. Colonel Davis named his by request, because white bomber crews requested the Red Tails so often.
The fact is they wanted the Red Tails. They felt comfortable because they could see the Red Tails above them, whereas in some of the other fighter groups, they would leave them. And that is because of the discipline that Ben Davis instilled in us, that your job is to escort the bombers, stay with them.
We couldn't do anything about the flak. We couldn't do anything about impossible weather. But when they got their 51s and were told to stay with the bombers regardless, good chance I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for that fighter protection.
On September 10th, 1944, a year after the War Department had almost pulled the Black Airmen from combat, top brass from the Army Air Forces visited Ramitelli to personally decorate 4 of the group's pilots. In spite of the honors and the escort requests, many white bombers had no idea the Red Tail pilots were black.
They didn't know Ramitelli existed. It wasn't on their maps. In a couple of cases, they had to make emergency landings there, saw the Red Tails, said, "Oh, great, we're at the Red Tails base. We've got it made now." And only after they saw the African Americans running around, maintaining the planes, getting the planes ready for their missions, those sorts of things, that they even realized there were black people doing this in the Air Force.
In December, one American bomber group force landed at Ramitelli.
There were a couple who were from the South who were really prejudiced, and they said they're not going to sleep with any niggas. So they went to go sleep in their plane. And it was cold, and it was aluminum, and it gets even colder. So finally, about 2 o'clock in the morning, these guys knocked on the door, said, "Can we come in?" And they stayed with us for about 3 or 4 days, and we had some good conversations. But after they left, one of our officers who was censoring the mail came across this letter written to one of the officers' wives, said, "I spent the last 3 days eating nigger food, sleeping with niggers, and I am sorry, and I hope you will take me back."
That gave us some indication of how deep the racism was among some. But I have to say, in fairness, the majority of those who were there did interact with us as individuals, as human beings.
By the start of 1945, the Allies had beaten back a daring Nazi offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. Now they prepared to deliver the final crushing blows. Army Command assigned the Red Tails to their longest mission yet. They would cover the first leg of a bomber raid on the Daimler-Benz tank factory just outside Berlin.
Normally our missions would be 1,000 miles round trip. It's going to be 1,500 miles round trip. So when the P-51s would take off on these combat missions, they would have wing tanks. They have supplemental tanks so that you have more gasoline in order to accomplish those longer missions. And when you got into combat, you would drop those wing tanks, and so that you could have more maneuverability of the planes.
The Red Tails ground crew worked round the clock to attach the needed tanks to the P-51s. Mission day arrived March 24th, 1945. As always, Davis issued stern orders to his men.
General Davis told him, said, look, we're going on this mission, and don't you ever leave one of these bombers. If I catch you leaving a bomber, he said, don't land on this base, you land somewhere else.
It was an especially dangerous mission because of all the flak, the anti-aircraft defenses around Berlin, but also the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would be there protecting Berlin.
At the halfway point, the unexpected happened.
The group that was supposed to relieve us as they went over the target got lost and failed to show up.
With strict orders to stay with the bombers, the airmen set their sights for Berlin, knowing their fuel supplies could run dangerously low. As the Red Tails and the bombers neared the target, they suddenly encountered the enemy.
Out of the side of my eye, called 9 o'clock, I saw these streaks coming. Now, these streaks were the German jets.
The planes were Messerschmitt 262s, the world's first jet fighters.
ME-262 has a speed that is actually 100 miles in excess of what a Mustang can achieve. The jet is working against you with 430-millimeter cannon, and those are big shells. If one of them hits you in the wrong spot, your plane is going to disintegrate.
I knew what they were. They were coming in to attack the bombers. I said, drop your tanks, follow me.
The Red Tail pilots had just one advantage over the Nazi jets: maneuverability.
Instead of going this way, I went down, turned the plane upside down, went down under the bombers, and then made a hard right turn, and I caught one of the jets just as he was coming in to shoot down the B-17. I hit him broad stream, boom, he blew up. Bailed out.
The Red Tails downed 2 more of Hitler's ferocious jets. The bombers hammered the target.
I looked at my fuel gauge and it was below half because I'd used a lot of fuel in the combat. So I really didn't have enough fuel to get back to Ramitelli. So the alternate site was in the event, it's called Rimini. That's it. I'm coming in. I called it. I came in and landed. And when I pulled it in, the engine clunked out because I had run out of gas.
The Berlin mission earned the Red Tails a Distinguished Unit Citation for outstanding performance of duty.
The citation recognized not only our work in combat, but our work in the ground crew and getting those tanks there, getting the planes ready to go.
Back in the U.S., the home front battles were heating up. The all-black bomber group, the 477th, would lead the fight. The Army, reacting to escalating racial tension, had shuttled them from base to base for months. In March 1945, they landed at Freeman Field, Indiana, where General Frank Hunter and Colonel Robert Selway were in command.
Hunter and Selway, there's no way to put it, they were racists, they were white supremacists, they resented having to have African Americans around them and did their best to get them out of the Air Force.
Selway did everything he could to enforce segregation and circumvent Army regulations that stated that all officers could use base clubs.
He designated the officers' club on the base as for instructors only, and he created a second officers' club for trainees only. And he also classified every white person on the base as an instructor and every black person on the base as a trainee. It's a very transparent effort to segregate the officers' club.
The men of the 477th refused to use the trainee club.
We wouldn't go there. We wouldn't eat there. We wouldn't do anything. You couldn't go to the PXs. You couldn't go to the show.
We just knew that it was something that we couldn't stomach any longer. It was the final act.
So we decided that we would look for a time and that we would go and we'd make a test of it.
In a carefully orchestrated act of civil disobedience, the black airmen set out to integrate the white officers' club.
So we had them all dressed in first-class uniforms, and we sent them 3 at a time to the officers' club.
I was maybe the second or third group of 3s, and we sat at the bar, tried to order a drink, but the bartender says, "I can't serve you." And we said, "Why not?" "We're ordered not to serve it." That's enough in the Army. When somebody orders you, that you have to comply unless it's very unreasonable. And so we left. Other groups of 3 came along, and the very same thing happened to them.
So we went down there, and they had this officer outside. He said, "You can't go in." He said, "You got to be a member of the field." I said, "Well, I'm a member of the field." Said, "In truth, that no niggas can come in." Well, that made me mad.
Barred from entering and fed up by the treatment, Roger Terry and 2 other officers pushed their way into the club. Desperate to regain control, Selway, with Hunter's backing, drafted a new base order designed to reinforce segregation at Freeman Field. Selway then ordered the airmen to sign the document, saying they fully understood and tacitly approved the policies.
And that was the last straw. Because in other words, yeah, you resent the hell out of this. You're being treated as an inferior, and they want you to okay it. It's like ramming it down your throat.
We were determined that we would not cooperate in any such arrangement.
101 men said, "We're not signing that." That's all there is to it. You can do anything you want.
When we disobeyed those orders, of course, it was disobedience of a direct order, which was punishable up to including death under the Articles of War. It didn't enter our minds about, what the consequences might be.
The 101 men were arrested. 3 were also accused of using force when they entered the club.
It dawned on me, hell, I took on the Army. And I took it on at my own risk. And I'd do it again.
It's a tremendous public relations nightmare for the War Department. It's obvious that Selway has been trying to get around War Department regulations that prohibit racial segregation in recreational facilities on Army bases. And the black press is pushing this. Mrs. Roosevelt is all over the War Department. The NAACP is asking for updates almost every day on what's happened to these officers.
So what do we got? We had a standoff.
But events on the national stage suddenly overshadowed the mounting crisis at Freeman Field. As the nation mourned President Roosevelt's death, the Army quietly moved the Freeman Field protesters from the base.
On a very bad day, they had some transport planes come in, and they put 101 of us, I was not one of those 101, on these planes and took them to Godman Field, Kentucky, which was on Fort Knox, and put them in a stockade. In other words, a group of barracks that were surrounded by barbed wire fences that were at least 14 feet high. And they were imprisoned.
An area was cordoned off, and floodlights were put up all around there with armed guards. And of course, we could, even from our quarters, see the German soldiers, prisoners of war, had much more freedom than we did.
They wanted to court-martial all 101 of them for disobeying orders. But the problem is the orders violated the basic Army's code of conduct, where if you were an officer, you went to the officers' club. They didn't say anything about black and white. They hadn't put that in the code.
Days later, aware of the explosive situation, Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall intervened. He ordered that all except the 3 accused of jostling be released, but it was not without penalty.
We were given reprimands, which is made a part of our records, in lieu of court-martial. And that's about the second punishment to court-martialing.
For the 3 still under arrest, a court-martial trial was held.
If there was any fairness about it, there wouldn't have been a trial.
2 of the 3 were acquitted. Roger Terry was convicted.
Terry was put out of the service, and it turns out that his charges in the service were synonymous to felony charges in civilian life, which meant that he couldn't vote, he couldn't do things that felony people were prohibited from doing also.
You'd be surprised what it does to your mind. You become morose. You're quick to take offense. It took a long time before I got around to being congenial.
The all-black bomber group would never get to fight the enemy overseas. On May 8, 1945, 3 weeks after the Freeman Field Mutiny, Germany surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to an end. All told, America's first black fighter pilots had flown more than 1,500 missions, shooting down a total of 112 enemy aircraft. Of the 450 black pilots that served, 66 had been killed in the line of duty. Over the summer, their fellow airmen began returning home.
Coming into New York Harbor with the flags waving and everybody exhilarating, Statue of Liberty.
Down the gangplank we go. There's a soldier that has assigned white troops this way, colored troops this way.
Back home, back to reality. Segregation, discrimination, and everything else that went along with it.
And over with the white troops, there was a whole bunch of press and bands and so on. Over with the colored troops, the black troops, there was one reporter and a small band. And I said to myself, welcome back to the good old USA.
The double victory had yet to be won.
The double victory
The war
had
and
yet
the men who
to be
served
won.
and sacrificed had laid the
double
ground.
victory had yet to be won. And it still hasn't been run. This is about the end of the video. You've gotten the essence of exactly what happened with our our Tuskegee Airmen and the bomber group. He said never got a chance really to fly. Were put in stockades. Roosevelt never really ended segregation and supported these racist individuals who heap disdain and brutality on our airmen. But moving along, our men kept the faith and they did what they had to do. And whenever they were put in a chance to do it, they were better than the rest. They withstood attacks. Some of these men went home and their people were fighting to end racism and discrimination. But that never really ended until 1964, when Lyndon Baines Johnson supported the creation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that didn't end it. We still had to fight. We still had test cases. We still had to fight, hire civil rights or affirmative action officers in order to get the job done. But you cannot erase historically how wonderful, how positive these young men and how strong they were to withstand the brutality, to withstand the racism, the stockades, segregation, the discrimination, and move ahead and get done what has to be done. So you've seen the video. Get a chance, lift up, and find out as much as you can about your history. Because the only way our young men and women will be able to move forward with our support is to know their history. And it's very, very important. That's why we do historical programs routinely on the Richard James Show. We share the information with you. We want you to know what happened. We don't believe in hate. We don't believe in discrimination. And personally, I don't believe in war as a means to settle individual disputes and problems. All I am saying is give peace a chance. Let's try to peacefully settle individual problems. We're not right-wingers. We're not left-wingers. We're just simple, blessed human beings trying to create a life of positivity for us and our family. Well, it's near the end of the show. And we always try to lift up our business. Our business is African Paradise, located at 35 South 8th Street in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. This is a picture here. See African Paradise. You see statues, oils, clothing. And I want to say too, I get friends that come down and visit me and they'll say, look, I just have too much stuff. I can't afford to buy anything, but I just want to say hello. And these are very close friends, but yet they need to buy at some point a bar of soap. We sell soap. They may buy oil. We sell oil. They're gonna buy someone a Christmas present. You see our black Santa Clauses, you see our statues. At some point, for a birthday or forget, they're gonna do it. And what are they gonna do? Go to the white merchants and the major merchants and keep saying how much they support and love black businesses, but yet they can't spend a dime on that black business. I'm gonna be straight up and say that. Some people that will walk past that stand and not even say hello. I'm talking about our people. And all I'm saying to you is that we're not looking for charity. Black businesses, if we were looking for charity, we'd be a not-for-profit organization. We're looking for a successful business in this system. You see, we got djembes, we got statues, we got beautiful original painting and art from Africa. And all we need is you. All we need is your support and your love. All we need is you. So come visit us. Our number is 717-724-7150. Our address is 35 South 8th Street in Lebanon. Lebanon is a beautiful little town. They have tremendous restaurants and other things. Also, the Veterans Administration, this building is there. So come on down. We love to see you. We're always glad to see you. But God knows that if we're to succeed as a people, then we have to have Black businesses that are successful. And the only way we can be successful, the first thing you have to do is to have your own family to support you. If your family don't support you, oh my God, war unto you. God bless. Thank you, Chris Thomas and the Thomas family for lifting up the voice, 17104, and giving us a voice and a vehicle to do things. Thank you so much, sir. We appreciate you and yours. And God bless. You take care now.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. We thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.